Okay, thank you, everybody. Although I'm holding a microphone, there's no actual amplification. So this is purely for effect. No, it's for the film, but there is no application, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak clearly and for you guys to please listen well. Okay, children? Right. Welcome to the first of our on-demand events. We're Ravelin. We are pretty new, so hence this is the first of our events. We do fraud prevention and margin protection, and we do it for a range of different types of businesses now, but our roots are really in on-demand, and it's because of those roots, and it's now our privilege to work with people who work in the sort of, I guess, the engine room of these on-demand companies. So there are people working in operations, people working in finance, people working in customer service. So I suppose from a outsider perspective, it's the stuff you don't see, it's the invisible work. But it's a really critical part of building an on-demand business, a sustainable on-demand business, and a successful on-demand business. So while we're talking about this internally, we thought, well, you know, wouldn't it be interesting if we sort of turned that thing inside out and we actually spoke to people who work at those, in those roles and building those businesses, and see if there's some insight that they can share that we don't normally see. We see a lot of stuff about brand building and a lot of stuff about customer acquisition, but we don't necessarily see stuff that's sort of at the core of making these things tick and run and be successful. So that's why we're very lucky to be joined by our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly in 1 second. I'll just talk before that about the format. There's no presentations tonight. We're not going to go through any slideshows. It's going to be a question and answer format. Luckily for you guys, I've thought of some questions before, which I'm going to pose and going to ask the panelists to respond. And then a little bit depending on time, but at the end, at the end of that section, we'll ask you guys if you have any questions you want to ask, and we'll move on to the next one. So we just, if that's clear, I guess we'll start. So Alex, do you want to introduce yourself? You don't need this mic.
I don't need that mic.
But if you're more comfortable with it.
How disappointing. Okay, I don't get the dummy mic. So my name is Alex Stephanie. I'm currently an entrepreneur in residence, which is one of those fun kind of tech job titles at a startup studio called Rainmaking. Essentially, that means I'm building startups for big public companies. Before that, I was running a business called Just Park, which is a parking app. We have a thesis that parking is a huge and dysfunctional problem in cities. It's a problem because of the huge amount of parking tickets, because of the cost of parking, and because of the inefficiencies. It's a hugely inefficient use of space, and even most car parks are empty most of the time. And finally, because of the circling. So IBM looked at this and they found that about 30% of city centre traffic is people driving looking for parking, which is obviously nuts. So I worked for that company, which was a peer-to-peer marketplace and also a B2B2C marketplace, taking this space and allowing drivers to book that space. So they have a space waiting there, so it's a premium experience, but it's also much cheaper than parking on the street. And I ran that business for a few years. I took it from 2 to 40 people. We raised money from Index Ventures. We also did the largest ever equity crowdfunding, which was 3.7 million quid and almost 3,000 investors. And so I went on a great journey, sort of expanding that business quite a lot. The other thing I did, which is maybe why, one of the reasons maybe why Ravelin have kindly asked me to come this evening, is I've written a book on the sharing economy. That was that very garishly covered book up there a second ago, called The Business of Sharing. It was published by Macmillan last year, and that's really sort of insider's view on the sharing economy. So I went around the world and interviewed the great and good people who founded businesses like Airbnb and Zipcar, and investors at Sequoia and Andreessen and Union Square and these kinds of folks, and worked out, why they were interested in the sharing economy. And it breaks the sharing economy down into these different stakeholders of regulators, of investors, of entrepreneurs and consumers. And it really looks at what is in the sharing economy for all these different parties and why it's become such a phenomenon and where it might be headed.
So my name is Paddy Fletcher. I'm the finance director at YPlan. YPlan, if you haven't already got it on your phones, is tonight's going out app. It started off in 2012 as a way to find last-minute ticketing inventory, and since then we've expanded heavily into tickets, as all the way up until 2017. We operate in London, in a few other cities in the UK, and in Dublin. And prior to that, I spent several years at Halo, in the engine rooms of building the world's second greatest taxi app.
I'm Will Hughes. I'm from a company called Paddle8. Paddle8 are an online-only auction house that specialises in contemporary art with price points between $100 and $100,000. So we're aiming to fill the white space between people like eBay and the kind of traditional bricks and mortar auction houses like Christie's, Sotheby's, Phillips and Bonhams. Prior to working for Paddle8, I worked for a small tech consultancy that provided the full technical infrastructure for Bonhams auctioneers. I'm here tonight, hopefully to give a little bit of insight into the kind of operational difficulties that we have to battle with every day. So I like to call it the beast to the kind of beauty that you guys see on the front end.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Lally. I'm one of the co-founders of Ravelin. So Jerry's given a bit of a background already about Ravelin, but I guess I can talk about this in more detail in some of the questions I think that will be coming up. But prior to Ravelin, I was working at Halo, the taxi app, like Paddy. I joined there as a first person hired in the finance team, helped that scale out the finance team over 6 countries. And we launched in 17 cities before retreating back from a couple of them as well. So got a lot of experience in how to do things and how not to do things in scaling an on-demand business.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody. So the first question that I have, and something that's always kind of bothered me about on-demand businesses, is what I call the day one problem, which is that you decide that you want to launch an on-demand business. On one side of the equation are suppliers who are looking for customers. On the other side of that equation are customers who are looking for people to buy from. And as an on-demand business, you've got to figure out, well, how do I square that circle? Where do I start first? Lots of different businesses have solved this in lots of different ways. So I guess I'll go the other way around this time and start with Nick. And maybe the Halo experience is a good place to start. Just where the Halo went from one day not having an app to having an app to, how do they expand that and get their supplier and customer network?
Yeah, so as Jerry said, in any marketplace, you've got a two-sided market. So Halo looked at that and said, so you can either tackle one side of the market and throw a lot of money at it and hopefully then the other side will come along, or you can try to service one side of the market independent and give them something that's of value so they'll use it regardless of if there's the other side of the market. So in Halo's case, they did this by focusing on the drivers first, and they did that by building a driver app that was useful to the drivers independent of actually having an app that gives them customers. So prior to having a driver app, drivers would be, jotting down how many rides they had in a day in a logbook. If they were that so inclined, they'd keep the cash receipts, log everything down. It was a very manual process. They'd never know how often they had a passenger in the back of the seat and stuff. And so Halo created this app where they'd log when they started a job, when they ended a job. It'd have stats about how much they were occupied, how much money they earned for the day, what their efficiency rates were. And drivers found this as a really, really great tool because prior to this, they didn't really have any analytics around how they use their day. And so by doing that, Halo was able to build up thousands of cab drivers without actually having passengers that then used the passenger app. And so when Halo actually launched the passenger app on day one, they had this pool of drivers there that were all ready to serve that market, and that's what enabled them to get.
Maybe I'll skip to Whiteplan. Is there, how did Whiteplan go about solving this? Theaters need customers, customers need theaters. How do you?
I think with Whiteplan, it's sort of similar in this idea that you have trying to help one side of the market without worrying about the other side of the market. And so with Whiteplan, there's a lot of shows on in London every single night. Whiteplan has 15,000 shows on a day. Not all of those shows sell out. In fact, very, very small number of them will sell out. Up until, if you've got on-demand capabilities, you can buy a ticket on a mobile device, you can buy it at 7 o'clock for a 7:30 showing. The ability to have those last-minute allocations of tickets is a godsend to all of the promoters. So there's a lot of comedy promoters out there, a lot of smaller theatre venues that have a lot of empty seats, and they are quite willing to get rid of them very, very cheap at midday to 7 p.m. on the day of the show. So with Whiteplan, we offered them the ability to have all of this extra, ability to sell their tickets at the last minute with great commissions for us, but they didn't mind because they were tickets that they were already written off. Before Y-Plan, they couldn't have sold anything at all. And getting in there with that last-minute allocation system, giving them something for something they used to just throw away, gave them helped us build up the relationship, so we could then say, and also can we sell that show next week and in 2 weeks' time, and you've got Bill Bailey coming up, we want to have a bit of that, and that's how it sort of began, as that sort of last-minute allocation idea that helped people when before mobile, there was no way to get those to that.
Yeah. And Will, in the sort of contemporary fine arts market, is there
in the fine art market?
parallel?
The fine art market, just to get things straight here, guys, was ripe for disruption. The traditional bricks and mortar model has been around for years, and so there is an appetite for something new. So let me just take this glass as an example here. So my beautiful contemporary glass. In a traditional auction environment, me as the customer would approach Osmond here as the member of the bricks and mortar auction house, and he would say, "Thank you very much indeed," and there would be a negotiation about the commission rates. But then Osmond would keep that item there in his warehouse for 6 months until the fine glass sale comes up. In which case, in which time something could have happened to the item, could get damaged, and you as an individual don't get to enjoy that item. What Paddle 8 do is slightly different. So we operate a dropship model. So if I can take the glass back, I keep the item in my house, in my cabinet, for the whole sale period until the item finally sells and one of our registered shippers comes and picks up the item, wraps it, condition reports it, and takes it back to their warehouse to fulfill kind of onward dispatch to the buyer. Sorry, I'll give you the glass back now. So what that actually does is give shorter time frames. We don't have, because we're not an asset-based model, we don't have warehouses, we don't have full kind of acres and acres of warehouse space to fill with works of art. So suddenly we've got very fewer overheads. So that means that we can pass that cost on to our clients and say, right, instead of it being a 25% buyer's premium, it can be 20, or instead of 15% vendor's commission, it can be 8, sorry, forgive me. So that we were able to pass a lot of those things back. Not only that, we hope that our art specialists and our brand is a lot more approachable than the traditional bricks and mortar auction houses. So our value proposition is quite unique in the marketplace.
Great, thanks, Will. And Alex, you've had the opportunity to speak to, I guess, quite a few companies about solving this problem. That's one of his. Yeah. Maybe with Just Park, or maybe more generally, there's some insight.
Well, I'll start with the more generally bit. So I think people often get quite bamboozled by this dilemma. So they go out there, they've already proven and validated the core value proposition to both sides of the market. They know they're solving a genuine problem, and they're like, shit, how do I do both things at once? I'm only one person, or 2 people, or 3 people. And they've got this sort of expression, chicken and egg, just going around in their head, and it's just a very stressful experience. I think the reality is typically that you need the supply first, as you've just heard in these kinds of scenarios, and it becomes a case of how do I sort of hack liquidity on the supply side, and then how do I placate that supply until the point at which I can actually drive some real, usually monetary value to that supply. So the example of Halo, it's okay. They're not going to churn because they're actually getting some analytics that's useful, and then they'll ultimately, get fares through the platform. So the question is, how do you get this supply? If that's what you need as the first port of call, how do you get that? And there's different strategies. So some people will kind of sort of fake it until you make it. I love the story of Hotel Tonight. They started out, they had no real inventory, and they were trying to sell at these hotels. So they basically just pretended that they had deals with all these fancy hotels, and they just sold nights there. And they were marked down nights, so if someone bought a night at the Ritz or other hotels, they would just get on the internet and buy the night's worth of hotels. But it made sense. It gave them that initial credibility, and from there they're ultimately able to get into a position where they can legitimately work with all of those partners. Or sometimes you'll hear about a peer-to-peer marketplace that finds it hard to get that initial sort of liquidity on the supply side. Maybe they're selling, whatever, they're selling chairs. But actually to get those chairs in from people is very difficult. So what can you do? You can actually buy those chairs and you can hold that inventory in the first place and you can become that intermediary in a peer-to-peer marketplace. So I think generally people need to think about supply first. They end up often thinking about supply last because most of these marketplaces, again, become supply constrained. And one of the reasons why I think Uber has shot up so much is because it's so strong on the supply side. So strong. There are so many people that will get in a car and drive for money, and the mobility of that supply around cities is fantastically good as well. So in the end, I think these marketplaces, in the beginning and in the end, in terms of their ultimate exit and size, end up being about supply. What we did at Just Park, we started as a pure peer-to-peer marketplace. We were called Park at My House. It was mums and papas renting out their driveways. And what I realized is that this is a pretty good business, but it's not going to scale up to be a really large business. So I led the rebranding of the company. We became Just Park. We started working with all the big parking companies. Today we work with the three biggest in Europe, and NCP, who are the biggest in the UK, and almost everyone of any scale. And that has been our way of expanding on the supply side, and now there's more than 1 million customers in the UK, which would have just been kind of inconceivable if we'd stuck to that original vision of peer-to-peer parking.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions on that topic of the sort of day one squaring the circle? Sure. Oh, sorry. I do need to...
Yeah, because we have someone of Yplan. I just wanted to ask what went wrong in the US.
With Yplan?
Yeah.
So Yplan is, I think, as Alex was saying, supply is king. And I think with Yplan in the US, there was a certain misunderstanding of how dominant Ticketmaster is. In the UK, Ticketmaster is not a big deal. It's there in the market. They sell a lot of tickets, but a lot of their tickets they sell are on allocation basis. They're tickets that everyone can get their hands on if they're big enough. They don't own venues in the way they do in the US. They don't own artist management in the way they do in the US. In the US, it's a very vertically integrated system where they own the stadiums, they own the artist management companies, they own the ticketing systems, and if you want to buy a Beyonce ticket, you haven't got a choice. It's not the same in Europe. And I think where we went, and I think the other thing about the US is the secondary market is a lot stronger than the UK and in Europe in general. I think in Europe, people mistrust secondary. When you see, you go to a football game and there's 50 guys outside looking a bit dodgy, waving tickets around, that's the image of secondary market. In the US, it's totally acceptable to go on StubHub and buy tickets for a baseball game tomorrow that are face value $50 and you're paying $400 because you know that wasn't an exciting game until that team is now in the playoffs. So that's it's just a more accepted level of capitalism around tickets. And weirdly, what's happened is that a lot of the secondary market players have become effectively primary ticketers, where baseball's a great example. They've got a lot of tickets to shift. StubHub says, if you give me them at 50% off face value, I'll take them now, and I'll drip them into the market as and when that team hits the playoffs or doesn't, and they take the risk at that point. So I think, to Alex's point, it really is all about supply, and you need to understand the supply dynamics of the market you're looking at. In the UK, what we're dealing with is a totally open supply model where anyone can pretty much get access to anything, and that's great for us. We can really grow with that.
Sorry, I'll take one more. Sorry, Sarah.
Right at the beginning, what was the minimum amount of inventory you started off with when you first started going out? How did you get your first? How many venues did you have live, and how did you get your first 100 clients?
It's a good question. I mean, just for clarity, I wasn't there at the very, very beginning. The very first ticket sold, in fact, it was even before the mobile app was ready. It was an Everyman cinema ticket that Ritas, the founder, delivered by hand outside the cinema, which was a fake it till you make it point. It was, we'll list cinema listings and say you can buy through us, And what we'll do on the back end is buy that ticket and then hang outside the cinema and hand it over as a bit of paper. So it's very much list anything you want, as long as you know that that ticket will be available. And as I said, most things don't sell out. And then use the app as a kind of a mystery front end to sort of show people. And as people, it becomes a little viral thing as everyone says, oh, I've bought my Everyman ticket on this app, it's great. It was very much a fake it till you make it model at that very, 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 very start. I'm not, to be honest, I don't know.
I think just to very briefly address that, I think the right thing to do there is to not think about your business as one marketplace and start thinking about it as lots of different marketplaces and doing those kinds of segmentation. Once you start doing that, then you begin to think about what does liquidity look like in a smaller marketplace? What does liquidity look like in a single user journey? And by that I mean liquidity for a Halo or an Uber is basically you getting a taxi in less than 4 or 5 minutes. Now, liquidity for a Y plan might be liquidity in a certain marketplace for a certain use case, which might be the Hackney Hipster, or it might be West End theatre tickets, or whatever it is. And it's only when you do those kind of segmentations and break down the overall marketplace into sort of smaller marketplaces do you really understand where you need to start and what is, what you need to gun for. And the KPI will usually come from, that precise kind of liquidity example. For Just Park, it's minutes walk from your final destination to a parking space.
Osmond.
Yeah, Alex, following on from a question, in terms of geography, just looking at that, do you just focus on you're a good example. Would you just start focusing on central London first and then expand slowly, or you see where the customers are and go to that area, or how do you start the journey, the customer journey?
Is that a question for me? I mean, what happened is we started out, as I said, as this peer-to-peer marketplace, driveways, at homes, at churches, at small offices. And we ended up with a kind of donut shape of inventory around cities. And of course, you don't have driveways in the center of cities. And so that's not good enough if you can only service customers when they're parking in the donut shape outside the CBD. And what we did with car parks and hotels is effectively sort of fill in the jam in the center of the donut. So it will probably depend on the business in general. That's how we did it at Just Park. Generally you want to go for pre-existing demand rather than creating demand. So that generally means attacking a kind of fairly big, obvious market, or at least working out if you can get some market share in there at an early stage.
I'm going to move on to the next question.
Just follow on to that. How did you resolve the sort of physical issue? So I have an app here, gives me right to a parking in some garage, but the garage, takes a different kind of payment and access. And
sure. Okay. In brief, sometimes there's an API integration. Sometimes it's a staffed car park and they can identify it from a number plate. Sometimes there's a camera that automatically recognizes the number plate and that goes up. So it will vary on the actual car park.
It actually leads very nicely to my next question, believe it or not, which is around building trust. This is getting people paid. So I'm going to ask Nick and Will this because they're two sort of contrasting types of supplier here. I'm just looking back at Halo again. This is a cabbie, drives a cab. He's collected cash all his life. He trusts cash. He might occasionally take a job from the radio cab. Doesn't really like it. And now you're saying this is going to be a cash-free experience. You're going to get paid whenever you get paid at the end of the month. That's a big trust leap for a cabbie to make. And on the sort of flip side of that, you're talking about an auction house, I guess, with Paddle 8, who's used to dealing with a certain number of suppliers or a certain type of buyer. And now you're sort of, I guess, disrupting that by having a different channel. How do you get them? How do you get the initial people to trust you that they are going to get paid, that this is a worthwhile thing because they've never heard of you before and you're new to the market? I'll start with Nick, if that's okay.
Sure. So at Halo, they did a couple of things. So they started off by taking cash only to begin with. So until the credit cards was ready, the drivers got used to the app. They knew that they were getting passengers. They knew that they had been using the app for a while. So they built up somewhat of a trust in Halo to do what they'd said they were going to do. And then when they turned on the ability to pay via a credit card, as part of the terms and conditions with the drivers, they said, we will guarantee you payment regardless of what happens with fraud, regardless of what happens with a payment being declined by a bank. If you've picked up that driver, you can guarantee that whatever is on the meter is going to be in your pocket the following week. And then it's just being able to prove that this is happening and it builds up trust over time. But it's essentially providing them some guarantees that everything that you say you're going to do is actually taking place.
Is there a degree of like sucking up costs, sucking up risk in that?
Of course, you know, I mean, and because of that, you know, Halo had to wear some costs around fraud, for example. If someone's using a stolen credit card and ends up taking a cab ride, then that is actually a cost to Halo rather than a cost to the driver.
Right.
Just to echo what Nick said, really, and this is kind of going back to my time at Bonhams a little bit, but in traditional auction houses, when the hammer goes down, the vendor, they aim to pay the vendor within between 21, some auction houses, and 35 in others. What they will generally do is guarantee a set sum. So, for example, Tom, if you sell an item for £500 hammer, come 21 days, Bonhams would pay you out because they'd underwrite that debt, regardless of whether they can recover that from the buyer or not. And that was a great way of building up the lower end of the market there. At Paddle 8, our model is slightly more complicated. So it's payment within 30 days of us having received payment in full from the buyer. And they'll only do that when they've had the shipping organised, et cetera, et cetera. So our timelines on the post-sale are slightly longer. So we have to manage that carefully in terms of relying on our specialist relationships with their clients and things like that. But generally what we find is that we are getting our timelines, so yes, we pay out within 30 days, but that is beginning to be smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as our processes become more efficient.
Okay, great. Alex or Paddy, do you have anything to?
I think I've got a really boring comment on this.
Oh, great.
Which is that, you know, as an accountant, I think one of the most important things, and it's not so much building up, you know, cash in your account. Cash is king, and if you pay someone the cash, then they tend to trust you. But it's very, very easy inside your company to forget or lose track of how all that cash is flowing through. You know, if you're a large company like Halo and you're processing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds a week, or with 5, 10, 15, 20,000 drivers, or Y-Plan we've got 2, 3, 4, 5,000 partners. Unless your internal processes are completely bang on from day one, you're always going to have some mismatch somewhere that says, I think we should have this much money in the account and we don't, and we should owe these guys this much money and we've probably paid out more than that already. And it's too easy to forget your accounting processes at the beginning of the setup and just say, oh, look, it's fine, we just need demand right now, don't worry about the accounting, when actually you really should worry about the accounting, because it's only on that first transaction you can genuinely spot the money flowing through, because once you have 500, it's gone.
I'm actually going to ask a sort of an addendum question to that, which is, I guess, slightly the other side of the equation. So we know about discussed paying the suppliers, and we can talk more about it. The other part of running an online business is collecting money. It's, you're opening up some sort of payment gateway. Sorry. Yeah. Do you want to come in? Please come in. So we're talking about the other side of the equation, so collecting payments. So you open up necessarily an online payment, it's cash-free, it's credit cards. New businesses tend to put out things like voucher schemes. Sorry, Alex, are you going to interrupt me? Oh, it's okay. So people put out voucher schemes in order to attract business in. They have, and just to your point, Paddy, which reminded me of it, which is that the accounting practices, maybe while you're growing, are not as robust as they might be. The same is also true with fraud prevention, fraud thresholds that you might have in a business, because you're not that worried about taking on some bogus payments because you want to grow the company as quickly as possible. But that begins to hurt after a while. I guess in put in form of a question, I mean, what sort of general advice can you give for setting up a payment structure to begin with? And I guess in a secondary one, what sort of what you'd be thinking about around fraud prevention and not getting completely, I'm trying to think of a nice word, but reamed
Okay.
by fraudsters.
Alex,
yeah.
I'll have a crack at this one. So very quickly on the sort of cash versus e-payments point, I'll make a sort of very simplistic point. There are times when people do not want to get paid online, and I think there are certain businesses, like maybe the online cleaning marketplaces, for example, that have suffered from that because cleaners don't necessarily always want that digital trail of income. But generally, that's the exception. Generally, getting paid online is awesome, and the various APIs that exist to build online payments, including those specifically for marketplaces, you create a lot less, take a lot of the friction out of these marketplaces, and that again is one thing that helps create liquidity and basically gets them working and on this virtuous cycle. Quick anecdote, one of the things that really moved Airbnb's growth up was when they started taking payments online. There was this very awkward moment where you had actually got to know someone, but then you had to transfer money physically between the host and the guest. And very, very awkward, no one enjoyed that. And taking money seemingly out of the equation by putting it online helped them ramp up their growth a little bit more. To your question around fraud, again, I'll make a fairly broad point here. I think the best approach to fraud is generally to work out what it is you can automate and what you can't automate, and then build the right tools on the automation side, and hire diligent but fairly cheap people to do the stuff that it's not effective or not cheap to build tools to automate. And how they drop in, what those two buckets of stuff you can automate and stuff that you can't automate look like will depend on the actual business.
Okay, great. Nick, Halo again probably has the most dependency on the smoothness of the payment of the four companies here. It has to be instant. It has to be broad set of payment types. Is there any sort of insight you can give her? What's a good way of setting that up, and what's the risks?
So I guess from a Ravelin point of view, we see this over and over again. When people set out with new companies, new marketplaces, fraud's the last thing that they have in their mind. It's all about customer growth, and so during those early days, you want to take out any hurdle that there may be to stop you getting those customers on board. And so generally it comes about when a couple of years in, you're doing your marketing on the tube or whatever it is, and you're seeing the Halo logos everywhere. The fraudsters are also the ones seeing these ads on the tube and seeing the cabs drive around with the logos on it. And that's when you see this big spike in fraud. So most companies that we're talking with are going through the same problem, and where they think that fraud was never going to happen to them, suddenly they're losing tens of thousands of pounds a month. Halo went through that cycle. And I think what you're trying to do, what complicates the matter is trying to make that experience for the customer as simple as possible. So the more things that you can do to stop fraud, the more difficult it is to attract customers. And so you want to have some type of fraud detection in the background that doesn't inhibit the customer journey at all. So you can still have that seamless onboarding, that seamless flow, what seems like collecting the minimal amount of information possible, and make sure that the fraud detection that you have in the background is working away, looking at all of these pieces of data and making a decision on whether or not someone's a fraudster without the person actually knowing that this is happening and it's not affecting their onboarding and their journey. But I think from a risk point of view, it really depends on the company and where they are in their journey. So a more mature business is probably more likely to be looking at every last cent on their margins and be really on top of fraud, where someone that's growing 30%, 40% month over month, fraud just isn't at the top of their to-do list.
Sorry, I was just going to kind of chip in here that at Paddle 8, we're beginning to kind of move past the initial balance of doing less fraud prevention to encourage membership growth. So we're beginning to review all of our practices, and I'm very much of the opinion that you keep your front door very stiff, so it's hard for people to come in. and you just make sure that your backdoor is as locked as possible. So what I mean by that is that make sure that your solution is layered. Don't rely on one fraud app to cover all of your bases. So tighten up your KYC. Make sure that you're validating IDs if that's necessary, and then make sure that you have all of your fraud prevention settings at your gateway, as well as a Ravelin or kind of other such tool. So that's a really important point.
You guys have some, a different level of sort of fraud prevention system. You must have, certainly, mustn't you? Because you have, fake art selling, which is, not feasible with any of this.
Yeah,
it's totally different.
So you've got the fake, you've got fraudulent activity happening on both parts of the chain. You have people who are trying to sell fraudulent art online, and the people who are trying to defraud Paddle 8 online as well. So we have industry-leading experts whose very job is to kind of familiarise themselves with the item, research the provenance, make sure that all of the correct certification is there in place, ready for the sale to happen online. So that is less of a concern, and we're pretty good at spotting anything that comes in. With regards to stopping fraudulent payments coming in, is a different matter entirely, and the business development teams will begin to experiment with new sale categories, and that will begin to bring a whole new level of risk. So we've just had a sudden spate of people defrauding us, but with addresses from hotel addresses. Weirdly, I've never come across that before, but it's happening, and it's happening in spades with us. So, and it's not happening in one geographic location either, it's happening in multiple places. So, but that goes on to our question about the expansion and the risk that's associated with expansion. Unless I'm stealing your thunder now by
No, that's a totally separate thing. Sorry, go ahead. Can I give you this?
You can. I'm using Stripe as my payment. So how does that work with fraud prevention? What additional fraud prevention measures do I need to put in place?
Yeah, Stripe offer nothing. The very, very bare minimum, and I'm sure that you guys will nod with me here. Sorry.
So yeah, we've got a number of customers that have used Stripe that are coming to us. So it's got some basic fraud detection in place. It starts to hit its limits when the advertising on the tube is out there and you start to get coordinated attacks from fraudsters. That's when it starts to creak, and the fraudsters find their way around Stripe and other payment gateway fraud. If you can imagine, most of these payment gateway fraud detections look at the last mile of the journey. So it's all the information you enter in when you're at the checkout. And that's quite limited. And so what we're trying to do at Ravelin is collect data from the moment someone lands on your site, all their interactions they have, when they register, when they add payment methods, what are the properties of their order details, and all of that helps to create a picture of whether or not they're going to be fraudulent, rather than just looking at the credit card at the end of that last mile. And so that's why we're able to get better results than the likes of Stripe.
It might be good to get Paddy's answer to this, because you had a payment gateway, presumably had some sort of fraud prevention on it. What was your experience with that?
It was, as Nick says, it was very rules-based. All the payment gateways, they offer a kind of basic system. They're always trying to upsell you to their sort of in-house version, but it's just another level of rules-based ideas. And it requires a lot of understanding of fraudulent activity for you to set those rules yourself. And not every company has the capacity, just operationally, to go through all those rules. Sometimes it's actually very nice to pay someone a very, very small amount of money, and they help you, hold your hand through that process and say, well, actually, forget all the rules together. Here's a nice shiny algorithm that fixes it for you. With the rules-based system that we were using, it was great for certain activity, but it couldn't suck up enough data from us to understand the differences between buying, 5 tickets to go to a cinema, which is a sensible transaction, and 5 tickets to go to the theatre, which actually is a lot more fraudulent. And it couldn't differentiate between those two. Or 2 tickets to go and see the theatre that was 300 quid, or 100 cinema tickets that was also 300 quid. Well, that, on a rules-based system, we go, a hardcore value of 250, but the theatre tickets are fine, the cinema tickets are not fine. So you do need to, at some point, realise you need to step up your game a little bit.
Well, I think there is a scaling issue. I think it depends on where your business is and its growth cycle. So right at the beginning, a fully blown fraud prevention product is probably too much. But very quickly, and again, don't advertise in the tube if you don't want to get track fraud. Once you start doing that, you are going to need more robust fraud.
It's not
products.
a joke, though. I mean,
Oh, I know, yeah.
Genuinely, the more advertising you do, the more fraud you'll see.
Yeah.
It's a complete, one-to-one relationship. And certainly with YPlan, it's one of those things where the minute you spot it, it's too late, because you only spot it from a chargeback, and that's already 6 weeks out of date, if not 8 weeks out of date.
Yeah.
And you'll see it get a lot worse before it gets any better.
Okay.
Also, some payment gateways are better than others. Just to be kind of fair to the gateways, you'll find that gateways that are associated with a larger payment processor are fairly unwieldy in terms of how they're like Elevon, Adyen have got another big processor that own the whole of the transaction chain, but their basic level fraud prevention tools are really good, and they get even better if you pay even more money. People like WorldPay, again, the WorldPay stuff is very basic, but gets better when you pay more money. Braintree is actually fairly clever with a kind of entry-level fraud system. But yeah, okay. It's generally the ISOs who are working as independent gateways that aren't owned by a processor that work better, with the exception of Adyen.
Sorry, I will come back to more open questions at the end. I just
wanted to know what type of fraud percentage you would expect in taxis and YPlan and Just Park, because I can get it for TV set.
selling TV sets.
No, buying a TV set with fake money and just getting it.
So yeah,
I don't really get the people with fraud to buy like a £5 taxi.
Yeah, so it's pretty common. So I wanted to see how easy it would be to be a fraudster. So I went onto the dark web. I used some Bitcoin. I went to the checkout process, found a marketplace that was selling cards, and all of that from start to finish took about 15 minutes. And you can buy stolen credit cards for around about $3 or $4 a card, and they have a money-back guarantee. So if you use it within 3 hours and it doesn't work, they'll swap it out for another card that does work. Yeah, and they pride themselves on the service. In
the meantime, they've taken your card details.
What is the motivation for this? Like the kick of fraud?
I think it's just. For kids these days that are doing it, they view it as the same as pirating a movie. They kind of just think, well, the consumers are protected, they get their money back from the banks, and at the end of the day it's the merchants that wear the cost, and they just price it into their goods, so the police aren't going to do anything about it, so they can get away scot-free, so they're just doing it to either make money or get free cab rides around or whatever they need to.
Is it a large percentage? Is it big?
So it can be, so it depends on what you're selling, but anywhere from say 1 to 5% of your total turnovers can end up being paid with fraudulent credit cards if you don't have any fraud detection in place. If you have fraud detection in place, like we can get fraud down to 5 basis points, so almost cut it out completely with little impact on overall conversion as well.
I'm just conscious of time. I just want to move on to the next question, which is one around expansion. So we've seen through history, recent history, successful expansions and unsuccessful expansions of on-demand businesses where they've moved typically into geographies, but could be into cities, sometimes into different services. And some have been incredibly successful and some have been incredibly unsuccessful. And I might start with Alex on this one. I'm just wondering, if I'm running an on-demand business and I'm considering the next step, I'm considering where I'm going to go next, what are sort of the good criteria for making that decision, and what, conversely, are bad criteria for making that decision? What should I be looking for in my business which says, that's the next market for me, and again, the opposite is true, that's the wrong market for me? Is there any guidance?
Yeah,
you can give?
I guess the sort of starting out point would be, what does your existing market look like? If it's a relatively small market, then that would probably suggest getting out of it relatively soon. People differ on when is right. Some people think you should go before you're actually ready, sort of throw yourself into it. A friend of mine who co-founded BlaBlaCar, he always says just like expand before you're ready. And it's worked for them. They're now probably $1 billion or thereabouts company. But then many more companies have actually failed by expanding too early. So you'll see that companies that come from small markets, like Israel would be a good example, need to get out of that market quite quickly, because it's quite, if you've got the potential to be a very big business, it's very hard to be a very big business if you're just serving the Israeli market. Obviously, the UK is somewhat in between a market like Israel and the US. You can have some very, very good businesses that are just UK focused. I think as a huge generalization, businesses scale before they're ready to scale. And the reality is that to launch a business outside your home market is almost always a lot more expensive and almost always a lot more difficult than anyone thinks. I think I can see Robert, his VC, sort of nodding slightly. I think there is a perception there was a perception that you kind of need to crack America, and it's kind of, I think increasingly it's being perceived as this kind of adolescent TechCrunch fantasy, and people are getting a lot more grounded and realizing that you shouldn't expand too soon. You should continue to refine and improve your product and build your business in your own market, particularly if you're a long way from saturation.
Master your model.
Sorry?
Master your model effectively before you...
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Nick, you've been through some interesting expansion times.
So
Have you any lessons there?
Yeah, I think echoing sort of what Alex said there, so it's really understanding both the markets that you're wanting to enter and understanding the unit economics of your existing business. So often growth can be, you can confuse growth for success early on in a business, because some of the challenges that you may face don't really appear until you start to hit at scale. And it's only then where, if you've expanded too fast, suddenly you're in different markets, you realize that somehow you hit with supply challenges, or the unit economics aren't working out as you thought they would when you were in your early days of your business. And that's when you start to sort of figure, what are the next steps. And I think, that was, Halo had a couple of those challenges in the US. The US market was a lot different to the European market, very, very different on the supply side, very restricted in the cab space. Those challenges didn't really rear themselves until you sort of 6, 8, 12 months into launching a city, when you realize that you're actually hit with those supply side challenges.
Is there any sensible way, and I wonder if anyone in the audience would have an opinion on this, is there any sensible way of sort of ameliorating that risk? I mean, how do you sort of damage your exposure by moving into a new country, or new city, or new market? That's is there any way you can minimize that risk, or at least deflect that risk so it's not going to completely ruin your business? Oh, sorry, I'm going to give you the mic, if that's okay. Yeah.
You can look for similarities. There are places in the world that, if you compare New York to London for Halo, was a complete different thing. So you should not expand to there. But if you look at other cities that we expand successfully, like Madrid and Dublin, very similar in structure, in the supply side, very similar to us. So as long as you look for something that is similar to what you have already, you have a better chance. So you have to do a lot of research to figure out that right place.
Sorry, Osmond, did you have a point?
I mean, it's probably the same thing as him. Do some market research and just some testing before you actually say, look, tell everyone, we have spent £1 million opening in New York, and then 6 months later you crawl back. So testing on a small scale with less money probably take you further.
Yeah, it does seem pretty basic, but there seems to be so many companies rather who just don't do it, just don't dive in.
I think there's also some different strategies to that expansion, and there's a sort of own a market and the surrounding markets, or there's sort of go for these lighthouse big markets and then grow from those, sort of that hub and spoke model. I think Halo tried to do a bit of both. What worked out well was the European markets, where they sort of started, ended up being have very similar characteristics, and are the countries that have been most successful for them. And so, it really depends on on sort of the individual properties of each of those markets, but more often than not, sort of trying to expand in a geographical model that's closer and has similar properties can sometimes be a lot easier and more successful than trying to conquer the world all in one go.
I think also there used to be a lot of sort of second guessing going on, especially with a view to the US. Like, we've got to be in the US because we can raise more money there at a better valuation and we're going to get bought there. And I think that attitude is on the wane as well. Increasingly, it's a much more global world, and you have way more hubs of talent and tech. Money is flowing in much more complex ways between continents, and I think that whole kind of trend is on the retreat. And so I guess for anyone thinking about whether to launch their business abroad in a new market, I would always say the obvious thing of just make sure it's absolutely right for your business. Don't try and second guess what someone might think or what someone might do on the basis of this expansion. It's like hard enough if you're just focused on your business, let alone if you're trying to sort of do two things at once, and the second thing is inherently less valuable in any case.
I think on the flip side of some of these comments about the US, there is this problem where traditionally US-based businesses score bigger valuations, not just from the VCs, but also from institutional investors. And it's a comment that's been made by lots of European entrepreneurs, and Nicholas Zenstrom made it the other day, where if my business is exactly the same in Europe and the US pension funds will pile into it with big valuations and lots of money and lots of backing, and European investors just don't. They don't understand technology in the same way. They don't bet on it in the same way that Americans bet on it, and therefore, if you're not in the US, you don't get that big wad of capital to really go global. And this has been one of the bugbears of why European tech businesses tend to get bought by identical American tech businesses, because the Americans have the capital and the Europeans don't.
I wonder if we have any VCs in the room who want to respond to that. No? Okay. Yeah, sorry, Rory. Let me give you the mic.
So what about when someone identifies a market, say in America, that's getting traction quite early and they think it could be attractive to localise that for the UK or Europe? I suppose it's kind of like a little bit like Halo and Uber, but in reverse.
So I think that's the right stage to go. If you've done some tests, if you're getting traction, it means you're going for the right reasons. It's not because you're going there because the funding's there, or it's not you're going there because the founder is familiar with that city, or has ties to it, or whatever the reasons may be. I think if you're going for the right reasons and you've done the tests, or you've got a little bit of traction already and you can see that there is value in that market, then there's no reason why you shouldn't go for it.
Yep. Last.
Something that I really, really like is the strategy that was applied by OLX, a classified website of Fabrice Granda. What he did actually before selling it to Napster, I think, in South Africa, it was just picking all the unsexy countries. So like Portugal, Pakistan, countries that you would never go to because there was less competition there. The acquisition costs were far lower, than what you would expect in the UK. Because everyone, for instance, now coming from France or from Spain or from Italy would like to go to London. But London is incredibly expensive in terms of acquisition cost if you compare it to Portugal, to Greece, to Italy, or even to Southern America. So an advice I would give to people is go for the unsexy markets, if you can do it.
I was told Portugal was pretty sexy. Last question, and I did want to keep this to an hour or slightly over, so I'm going to finish with just nice, easy, uncontroversial question. So Brexit. It's timely. It's about, when is it? May? June? The referendum, June. This leads into expansion, leads from expansion. This is about growing your business both in geography and the market, sexy or unsexy, that you want to expand into, but equally the ability to attract and build the talent in this country in order to be able to build companies that can expand into those countries, that can compete with the Americans, whether it's with their VC money or with their... I might be slightly biased on this, I don't know if it's coming across. but I'm wondering if the panel have any thoughts. And actually, I'll start with Alex, because you're one person I have no idea where you stand on this, so it'll be interesting to see where you stand. Brexit good for British businesses or potentially not so good?
I mean, this is the interesting thing that no one knows, and everyone's just making up numbers. and hoping that more people believe their numbers. So, I'm not going to pretend to know for sure. I think no one does, but my gut tells me, and I say gut rather than sort of mathematical logic, that it would be very retrograde for Britain to leave the EU. I think economically it will be retrograde, but that's the hardest argument to make because there are so many unknowns. I think socially it will be retrograde because we've come a long way actually as a continent. We've had, in terms of actually pacifying what was a very volatile continent throughout the 20th century. We've done a pretty good job in the scheme of things by comparison with recent history. And politically, I think it will be retrograde as well, because really we need to be inside the EU. We need to lead the EU as a powerhouse of Europe. And we need to be part of a big trading bloc if we're going to have credible, grown-up conversations with the US and China and India. And so, I think as a nation it will be bad economically. For the businesses within the nation, it will be bad economically. Speaking specifically to the tech sector, I think there's a real risk that Berlin could end up being the #1 tech capital of Europe if we left the EU. There's also a risk that London could not be the premier financial capital of Europe as well. That is not inconceivable at the same time. What is the biggest challenge facing every startup in London right now? It's talent. It's talent. It's finding the best people. With the right team, you can do almost frickin' anything. And anything that blocks off potential talent to London startups, which is scarce enough as at the very moment that we speak, is going to be very, very harmful. So that's what my gut tells me. It scares the shit out of me that we might be out of the EU and Trump might be president by then. If one of those things don't happen, that's decent. But hopefully both won't happen. I don't think either will happen. I think that we'll prove to be a risk-averse people in the end. I do hope that the risk-averse people with common sense get out there and vote, and that the jingoistic people who are probably voting for the wrong reasons don't outnumber them at the polls.
Thank you. Paddy, what's your sort of one, two concerns about Brexit?
I think Alex has put it very eloquently. I think there's definitely, if you ignore all of the basic economic arguments and don't try and think about numbers that add up to £400 a week for every working family, if you think just purely as a businessman about the London tech sector, just as a sort of microcosm of Britain, the access to talent point is so critical in terms of UK graduates who are smart and bright. They flock to big blue chip organisations because those are the ones that are recruiting. London being part of the EU allows non-UK graduates to come to London without a job and then look for something inside the tech industry or inside the financial industry. If they had to get a job first, it's almost impossible to get them across the border. An issue, I've dealt with a lot of these visa, issues from people from South America and further afield, and it's such a drag for a small business to deal with those kinds of that kind of bureaucracy. There's a bigger risk in some respects that if we do leave the EU, not that Berlin will take over, but that nowhere will take over as Europe's tech hub. There's a reason why London has the tech hub, which is because we all speak English. There's access to good capital here. We have a relatively open and flexible working, model as a country. And Germany, doesn't really have that. If you speak to people who worked in Germany, it's a very rigid, system of working in those companies. You have to have extraordinarily good German to get a job. It's not the same environment that London offers startups. And I don't think it'll take over. I think nowhere will take over. And America will clean up.
Will?
Yeah, I was just going to say, from a very kind of inexperienced viewpoint here, that startups in America, they've got a ready-made marketplace to expand really quickly. If you're in a situation like us, where we've been a startup in America and now we're being a startup in the UK, and they're not necessarily seeing the growth in Europe that they may have expected, it's a very different marketplace, and we're having to traverse multiple territories. And okay, so having all of those hurdles in place make it hard for anybody to follow us. But Brexit just adds in another hurdle that will hinder our growth in Europe. And so, yeah.
Nick, is one immigrant to another?
Yeah.
What do you,
I'd just echo what the guys have said here already. I think the talent, having access to talent, is the biggest potential loss of Brexit. Because not only, I think a lot of things flow on from that. So if you can't attract the right talent, then obviously that impacts the costs of your business. Potentially you've got to pay more for the limited staff that there is available in the UK. That means that then UK businesses are running at different margins than potentially what they could for their US counterparts. That means potentially they need more funding, but will the funding be here if the talent's not available for these companies? Does all the funding that's here in the UK suddenly move to Berlin or elsewhere? So there's a lot of flow-on effects. I think that sort of are all centered around talent and being able to run your businesses in a relatively easy way like it is at the moment with people coming from the continent to the UK.
Does anyone in the audience have any views that they'd like to share? This is also the last question, so you can share a view on Brexit, or you can ask a more general question about what we spoke about earlier. One.
Just one final point that was missed out for Brexit. I guess it affects finance companies, banks and so on, is the passporting, the ability to passport any license you gain in the UK to any territory in Europe. So if we decide to leave the EU, that will potentially be stopped. We won't get the same sort of treatment that Norway and Iceland and other countries like that get, actually. But as Alex says, there's a lot to actually be negotiated. So once we leave, there's still going to be a few years of negotiation, so no one really knows. But I think
a few years would be an incredible result. Yeah. There would be more than a decade of wrangling over all kinds of different trade agreements.
Yeah. But yeah, those licenses which you can now get in one country and then passport elsewhere, that process could become a lot more complex. Which would
software licenses or
licenses? Banking licenses, e-money licenses, all those kinds of things.
Patents as well?
Patents, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So on the topic of Brexit, our company is looking right now for our first international city, and that will be right around the time they make the decision. Do you think that has any kind of impact if we launch before that decision is made or after?
I'd launch before. Get your foot in the door before anyone tries to kick you out. I mean, it depends where, I suppose, and what the business is. But
I think if there's a genuine case for your business to go internationally, and that's what you want to do, then you'll just need to wrangle the red tape as and when you come to it. I think whether or not you do it before or after, I don't know. If you're going to do it, you've got to do it at some point. So probably sooner better than later.
I think it's not the case that there's no red tape. If you wanted to launch in France right now, it's difficult. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of taxes to pay. There's an awful lot of random forms that British people don't understand because we don't bother with forms. French people love forms. And I think that isn't, that's here already. So it's not so much a question of it will make it that much harder to expand around Europe. It'll be that the UK as a whole will just shrink and shrivel. And people will exit and your house prices will go down.
Any more questions? No? Okay. Well, thanks for coming. As you probably noticed, we've filmed it. We'll be chopping up the film. We'll make it available. You'll get it to your email. We'll also push it out. I think the Twitter hashtag is London On Demand. But there'll be a variety of ways in which you'll be able to get the content. It just remains me to say thanks very much. There's more drinks and some wonderful food here. And I think you can come back in here, but basically between the two rooms. So obviously come and talk to me or my colleagues or anyone else about any of the stuff, or just talk about anything else. Just thank you very much.